It's a sad state of affairs when parents, scientists and medical doctors are on their knees to politicians and salesmen begging for protection for the health of our children. You'll see a long list of groups that have appealed, and they're rich in both quality and quantity. So this is a rapid 15-minute presentation, and I'm going to overview some common misconceptions regarding the use of non-ionizing radiation at non-thermal levels, with a focus on vulnerable groups. So common devices that use this kind of radiation are numerous and rapidly increasing, but commonly mobile, telecommunications, etc. Life is electromagnetic. That's how we work. That's how all life works. So it should be no surprise that these fields are having biological effect. But some try to allay concerns by saying, well, we evolved in an electromagnetic field, so it can't possibly be affecting us negatively. And that's true, we did evolve in a field, but it bears no resemblance to the one that we have recently created. The one that we now commonly see is broad-ranging, but can be up to a quintillion times higher, 10 to the 18. So the power density is dramatically different. But in addition to that, the characteristics of that radiation are also different. You can see in green there the natural background radiation and how it dips at about 1 gigahertz. And that is the very part of the spectrum that we've filled in with this anthropogenic or man-made radiation. And you can see in yellow the 1950s, orange the 80s, and then 2010 how it peaks there in red at high signal strengths in this relatively quiet area of the spectrum. And this happened really fast. In evolutionary terms, this is the blink of an eye or the beat of a heart, less than one person's lifetime. So it's not seen one generation from cradle to grave. But one would hope that safety limits are in place to protect us, and unfortunately they are not in this country and not where I currently reside in the UK. The reason I say that is because we're using something called the ICNIRP guidelines, and they were designed to protect against thermal effects only. That means tissue heating. We know that there are many non-thermal effects that occur orders of magnitude below those levels. And don't take my word for that. This is from the United States Environmental Protection Agency. The last line you'll see states, the generalization by many that the guidelines protect human beings by harm from all or any mechanisms is not justified. So many countries have lowered their guidelines to try to be more biologically protective. And even in these countries, those very low limits are still being criticized as not being low enough because there is scientific evidence of effects even below those levels, which are much lower than ours in the UK and here in the US. But some still argue that non-thermal effects haven't been adequately proven, or that we need more science, more research. I would dispute that on the basis of this, that there are tens of thousands of research papers now. Of course, there is some inconsistency. We would expect that when we're looking at non-linear biological systems being observed in different labs all over the world. But the majority do demonstrate harm. And when I say the majority, it's around 70% of unbiased literature. And that's reflected here in these studies. You can see in blue, it's hovering around the 70% mark that's showing impact to biology in all groups, not just humans, but plants and animals as well. Some people separate out Wi-Fi and mistakenly think that that is so weak that can't be affecting us. But unfortunately, that's not the case. And to put that in perspective, if you stand about 100 meters from a mobile phone base station, you might be in the beam of greatest intensity. And so you are in this case, looking at that signal strength on the left there. And you can compare that with emissions from a Wi-Fi enabled laptop that's actually at 50 centimeters, that's half a meter. Many children will use that much, much closer. And you can see the signal strengths, though, are still higher, and that could be an underestimation. So you can't move that laptop any further away or you wouldn't be able to use it. But some people instinctively think, well, we'll push the routers further away, and that might be protective by dropping the intensity, and that will drop the intensity, but I'm not convinced that we can call that protective. And the reason I say that is because intensity windows exist, where for a lower intensity of radiation, it can have a greater or more dramatic biological effect. In addition to that, biological impact is dependent on a great variety of different parameters, not just intensity. All of these other factors, including at the bottom there, the vulnerability of that individual, who is not like the routers that came off the production line. They're all very different. And we'll talk about that for a moment. Some people sort of say, well, if it caused all this damage, we'd all be ill. And a few are concerned that we are all becoming ill, and this is the World Health Organization predicting, I quote from them, a tidal wave of cancer. And you can see the distribution of that in dark blue, which I find interesting. In addition, lots of other disorders, and this is looking at autistic spectrum disorders. And it's interesting how the curve of incidence follows the ambient increase in RF. Now, I wouldn't insult you by implying that this graph alone means anything, because it doesn't. We can create graphs like this from almost any data. However, there are peer-reviewed published papers that are consolidating our concerns looking at this link and many other disease processes. So, of course, we wouldn't expect everyone to become ill at the same time. We know that not everyone who smokes a cigarette gets lung cancer, but we do know that there are people who are more vulnerable and therefore may become ill more rapidly. Children are more vulnerable for lots of different reasons, and these are just a few. Their skulls are thinner, so they have less bone shielding of their brain, and their brains contain a higher water content, particularly in the really young neonates. They're smaller, their systems are still developing, and they have stem cells which are exquisitely sensitive to this kind of radiation. They have a longer time ahead of them for some of the delayed or latent effects that can be decades after exposure. And a 5-year-old can absorb up to 60% more microwave radiation, and exposures in their bone marrow can be up to 10 times greater. So, very sensibly, some governments have issued warnings, and this is one from the UK, stating children and young people under 16 shouldn't be using their phones except for essential calls. And that's very sensible. However, we don't in the UK currently have the same caution for tablet use, which I don't understand, because tablets are not necessarily less powerful. You can see here that when you're looking at SAR, which is actually a poor measure of impact, but it's what's being used at the moment, the SAR, or specific absorption rate from a smartphone, can certainly be comparable with, or in some cases less than that from a tablet. Some schools feel under pressure and feel that they need to use wireless internet to be competitive in information technology education. Well, firstly, I draw your attention to the UN Convention on the Rights of a Child. I think personally that the use of this kind of radiation in the classroom is in direct violation of this convention. And it talks here about the best interests of children, making them a top priority, with an emphasis on health, saying that they have the right to the best possible health. Not some kind of compromise, but the best possible health and a clean environment. And these days, as a parent, if your child is going to be taken on a trip, or anything really that could involve safeguarding issues or health and safety, you're asked to sign a consent form. And if you wanted to sign a consent form for something like this, it might read, I consent to my child being irradiated by a Group 2B possible human carcinogen, exposed to a toxin shown in peer-reviewed published scientific studies to cause DNA damage and to other biological disruptions, such as, and there's a very long list, this is just a few that I've picked out. Personally, I would not be comfortable signing that form. And if you're not either, then all of us need to be rethinking the use of these devices in school. So I would emphasise that wireless radiation is not necessary for an IT department in a school. You can give your child a very full education by using hardwired alternatives. And France has banned Wi-Fi in under 3s and limits its use for under 6s. Vive la France! Electromagnetic hypersensitivity. So some children may also have this condition, making them additionally vulnerable. And this is a condition hallmarked by a broad range of symptoms, including headaches, dizziness, palpitations, mood disturbance, concentrational problems, etc., in response to these types of fields and some others. And there's a huge number of misconceptions about this issue. So some, and I've even heard doctors say this, which is really unforgivable, have said, oh, it has so many symptoms, it can't be real. And that's ridiculous. We only have to look at ionizing radiation sickness to see that that is how radiation works. It affects every system of our body. It's actually corroborating evidence, not against. Others will say that EHS is so rare they don't need to worry about it. But estimates vary between 4 and 10%, and extrapolated figures suggest that this is rising quickly, and some have suggested that 50% of the population may be affected by 2017. So this is not rare. In addition, some people think, well, my symptoms can't be EHS because perhaps your doctor has diagnosed you with something else, or you've taken medication and it's fixed the problem. That does not necessarily mean that the cause of it wasn't radiation. So we need to have a second look at that. Doctors are not well educated on this subject, through no fault of their own in general. And others are saying that EHS is caused by the nocebo effect, or symptoms induced by fear. The nocebo effect is real. It can happen in a number of circumstances in life, but it is not relevant to true EHS. It is not caused by the nocebo effect. There's a great long list of reasons for that, and I'd love to explore them, but we don't have time today. But feel free, please, to ask me questions about that at the end. And these are some of the figures you'll see along the top there for that we're looking at for a very large number of people being affected by these kinds of symptoms. So I mentioned that this is a group 2B or possible human carcinogen. This has been belittled many times, and certainly a lot of people are saying, but the risk isn't nearly as serious as with X-rays or smoking. Well, this is the COMET assay that looks at DNA damage, and you can assess quantitatively damage by looking at the length and density of the comet-like tail there. On the left, you'll see that sham where there is no toxic exposure, that's healthy DNA. In the middle, that's gamma irradiation, equivalent to about 1,600 chest X-rays, so alarming, possibly carcinogenic doses. And you compare that with just 24 hours of mobile phone radiation below current allowable guidelines. You can see that actually that looks extremely comparable. In addition, thank you to my colleague Sarah Starkey, who's done some excellent work here looking at the odds ratios from time from first use comparing tobacco and lung cancer with mobile phone and head tumours. And you can see that looking at time from first use, those are really comparable odds ratios. So we need to take that seriously also. In addition, some of the International Agency for Research on Cancer scientists have called for this to be classed as a Group 1. And this is a paper from Leonard Hardell and colleagues pointing that out, that this fulfills the Hill criteria for causality. So we should be classifying this again as a class 1, which would put it in the same group as tobacco smoking and X-rays. So I think it's time to really stop denying that we need to take this threat very seriously. Some think mistakenly that cancer is the only documented health concern, and it's not. There are loads, again, beyond the scope of this lecture, but this is a list I've put together. And there are mechanisms that explain these links, and I'm really looking forward to a lecture from one of my colleagues, Martin Paul, later on talking about calcium influx into cells. I'll leave that to him. And there are other mechanisms also described. So there are lots of pathways likely, same as with carcinogenicity, for example. But some people are left in disbelief, really, and think this can't be true. If it was true, then somebody would be telling us. We don't need to look back very far to see that the public were not warned in a timely fashion before. And it's time not to repeat our foolish mistakes of the past. And I really don't want people to feel despondent and that there's nothing they can do because it's everywhere. Because you can use the power that you have to change the things that you cannot accept. You can start by reducing exposure to the things that are within your own personal environment. But I would suggest that that is a bit of a half measure. Reducing exposure could be seen like smoking a low-tar cigarette. And if we're looking at vulnerable groups and defensible protection, we should be looking at eliminating these fields from our children's environments, immediately using airplane mode, etc., and replacing with hardwired alternatives. All children have a right to a healthy environment at school. They're often non-consenting and potentially non-benefiting parties. So the precautionary principle is really outdated now, it's overdue, and protection is an emergency. And adults as well. Everyone should have the right to avoid exposure to something with this level of health threat, should they wish. So in summary, we're electromagnetic, that's how we work. It should be absolutely no surprise that these fields are interfering with health, and present safety standards are not protective. Individuals can lower their exposure, and you can request governmental action. We need to be protecting vulnerable groups as an emergency. This presentation is dedicated to Jennifer Victoria Elizabeth Fry. Jenny took her life by hanging just over 1 week ago. This followed a long, lengthy set of correspondence from her parents to the school, to the local education authority, and to their local MP, who happened to be David Cameron, Prime Minister of the UK. They had been campaigning for 2 years to try and have Wi-Fi removed from Jenny's environment because they were utterly convinced it was damaging her health both physically and psychologically. Parents should not be forced to choose between educating their child and safeguarding them. There is science to back up these parents' concerns, and they're part of an ever-growing number. I feel really privileged to be here at an establishment that forever will be dignified by the wise words of Martin Luther King. There comes a time when one must take a position that is neither safe, nor politic, nor popular, but he must take it because conscience tells him that is right. Thank you so much.